Before I really begin, I don't even have my notes. My notes are over here. I'll have to pull them out. Before I even begin, I want to talk about the concept of a word that I have used very particularly in my show. It's a word called lamentation, and I use that word very particularly. I've talked about this somewhat before, but mostly on streams, so let me go ahead and codify this. For me, a lamentation is basically the bottom of the barrel. You've got the whole array of good, of course. There's lots of gradient to good. Then you've got neutral. For me, my opinion, the neutral, there's a lot of gradient to good, but there's only like one real category of neutral. It's either disinteresting or it's... You get it? It's disinteresting. The method by which it is presented is disinterestingly. Could be presentation, it'd be core material, it could just not be my thing, a coffee situation. But then we've got a big gradient of bad, and there's lots of bad, but it can really be quantified into several categories. Bad, fairly self-explanatory. And then if it goes a little bit further, it gets into so bad it's good. Obviously, this is a massively interpretive category right here, and everyone has a different opinion on what is so bad it's good. You understand the concept, though. It's enjoyable to watch despite its ridiculousness. Then you go one step further into really bad. I've found there are certain works that like loop around past so bad it's good, so it gets into just, what the hell. And then there's one last step past that, and that is just awful. Nothing redeeming, nothing interesting, nothing engaging, of irredeemable value. That is a lamentation for me. It has to be at the bottom in order to qualify as a lamentation for me. Why am I bringing this up here? Well, you know this because you've looked at the title up there. Even though, obviously by the time I'm recording this, I haven't done that yet. But, in your past and my future, you know this is not a lamentation. Would you believe I have been asked if Gray 17 is Missing would be a lamentation before I even started? As in, before I started looking at Babylon 5 in general. I've been doing this for just a little over a year now, going through Babylon 5. And even before I started, I had announced well before I actually started the B5 Ruminations my intention to hit this series. And it was among the first questions I was asked, will Gray 17 is Missing be a lamentation? And my answer was always pretty universally, I don't know. But one thing I discussed with Lurker, actually, specifically one of my regulars about this concept, was the idea that, again, a lamentation has to be way at the bottom. Gray 17 is Missing is, my opinion, the worst Babylon 5 episode, even though it does have some kernels of good notes. I know you can't quite tell here, but this is the A-plot of, the Rangers and all that. This is the B-plot of Gray 17. This is a pretty good visual representation. Again, I know, but it's basically split down the middle. This really is a very A-plot, B-plot episode. The A-plot and B-plot are completely segregated from each other, which is actually part of the reason why I dislike this episode. I'm used to that kind of thing in a lot of other TV, especially in Star Trek, but in Babylon 5, usually, even back in Season 1 when they were still finding their footing, they would weave A-plots and B-plots together. Even if it's only at certain connecting points, or they would affect each other. Sometimes they would be thematically linked. And again, as much as I bashed, I implied bashing of Star Trek just now by saying, I'm used to this from Star Trek actually fairly regularly wove in A-plots and B-plots. Sometimes either directly, the A-plot affecting the B-plot, sometimes purely thematically. Probably one of my favorite examples of this is... I can never remember the full name of the episode. It's a DS9 episode. It's like Faith, Treachery, and the Great River, I want to say is the name of the episode. Where the A-plot and the B-plot look like they cannot have anything to do with each other at all, and yet thematically and in terms of their message and their significance and what they do for the characters involved, they're actually very tightly connected together. So the fact that the A-plot and B-plot in this episode are just miles apart is one of the first complaints I have about this episode. And make no mistake, I'm going to tear into the B-plot of this episode. But why don't we save that for a minute? I just wanted to say this because it takes a lot for something to be a lamentation for me. And I know for a fact I have at least 2 lamentations in my future when we get to DS9 and TNG. I mean, bare minimum. Possibly 3, depending on how we'll decide that when we get there. But the thing is, I never really decide if it's a lamentation until after I've gone through the episode, after I've read the behind-the-scenes material, after I've already got my notes right here in front of me, and I decide, okay, based on this, lamentation or no. Let's talk about the good parts of this episode first. So they are actively recruiting telepaths. They're doing so despite its obvious flaws. And I do like the fact that they point out and add attention to the idea that there are some obvious flaws with that plan. Not just telepaths who might be Psychor, which is going to be actually kind of hard to prove, but telepaths who are not, which is actually going to be extremely easy to prove. When you already have telepaths working on your side, it is incredibly easy to tell if someone else is a telepath. I mean, duh, right? So, I also want to comment on something. I know this is related to the other plot, but this one woman has this line about I'm sorry. You know what? Why don't we save that for otherwise? I'm going to make a mark here. I think I know why this happened. Originally, the top half was supposed to be the Grey 17 plot, and the bottom half was the other plot, and I changed my mind like 5 minutes in. Moving on to the rest of the plot. So they try to find the Underground Railroad for the telepaths. They go to Franklin for that. So my first reaction is, about time Franklin's actually showing some reaction to being on Walkabout, to being free of the stim addiction, and that actually being relevant to his character. I actually just talked about this in the previous episode. Again, if you consider the fact that the previous episode was supposed to happen 3 episodes ago, well, 2 episodes ago, then it makes a little bit more sense. It still makes sense in character. I'm not calling that bad writing, but it is the kind of thing that made me kind of go at the time. I will also say this really quick. The stim addiction is horrible when you think about it. Most people, most addiction withdrawals, there's issues involved with that, right? I have actually gone through a single addiction withdrawal my entire life. Caffeine. I remember when I had to quit caffeine, it was giving me headaches. And when I say giving me headaches, I mean I was having trouble sleeping because the headache problem was nearly nonstop. And I talked with a couple of nurses, and I discussed the issue, and I was like, okay, I need to quit caffeine. And it did work. It got rid of the headache problem. Thank God I was right about that. But that first week was hell. And the couple weeks after that were pretty bad. And then I was about over it. 3 weeks, I was done. But I bring this up because most addictions that I'm aware of, most chemical addictions, let me make that statement clear, that I'm aware of, there's like a period of, ugh, and that's just the worst. And then once that period is over, there's a couple periods of, ugh. And then your system begins to adjust to not having the chemical in it anymore and goes back to what you'd call normal functionality. The reason I call the stems horrible is because the stems follow that same general pattern, but they stay in your system so much longer, which not only means that it will take you longer to start to be dry, but then it will take you much longer to adapt to being dry. See, the thing is, real quick, just to make this clear, some people think that, when you're recovering, just a little PSA here, when you're recovering from a chemical addiction, that whole period is, the withdrawal symptoms, is when you're in the worst state because it's, oh my God, the chemicals are attacking you or whatever, or the chemicals are causing the imbalance, and that's the problem. No, that's being caused by the absence. That's the dry period. You are now flush. You no longer have those chemicals in you at that point in time when you're going through the worst, what is usually considered to be the worst of the withdrawal symptoms, and then you have to endure that for long enough for your body, which is a very adaptable thing, in order to adjust to the fact that those chemicals are not there anymore, and then get back to regular working order. Imagine if that worst period, the dry period, took a while to get to, so your body has less time is adapting to it more, and has less time to adapt to being dry, and then that makes the dry period so much worse and so much longer because of that consequence. That's horrible. I'm just, wow. And the funny thing is, based on what I'm understanding, that would probably apply even if you weren't truly addicted to stims. Just utilizing stims on any kind of semi-regular basis would probably result in that. But anyways, it's horrible. I do find the price for his aid interesting. Leave me alone. Now, that is interesting because, A, I'm not... I mean, I know that it's half about the stims and it's half about finding himself, but I don't know if leaving someone alone when they're in that terrible of a state is actually a good idea, especially on a place like B5. And B, he's a very useful, very valuable person with good medical knowledge and also has things like the information on the rogue telepaths. So, I mean, functionally speaking, it's probably why Ivanova, if you pay attention, she never actually agrees to his terms. She never says, okay, or I won't follow you, or I promise. She never agrees to it. He finally relents, gives her the information, and says, go the hell away and leave me alone. We'll see how that goes. So I do find it interesting that Neroon sees Delen's movement as political. I find that interesting because he's absolutely right. At least, he should be. We as the audience, and this goes across all of fiction really, tend to have this perspective that the good guys can get away with whatever because they are the good guys and they're right. I don't mean like being good guy makes you right. Good guys make mistakes too. What I mean is the good guys have access to all the information, or at least most of it, kind of like we do, the viewers. Or sometimes the good guys don't have access to the information, but we do, and therefore we know they're making the right call. So we know what they are doing is correct, but that's because we're a third-person perspective. We have access to all the information at hand. If we didn't have that, what Delen is doing is a massive power play. And Neroon lays it out bluntly. And he's right. What she's doing is a massive power play. But we know the information he doesn't. We know she doesn't want this. We know she is not politically motivated. We know that she is not actually pushing for this for some kind of messianic desire to rule the people. But he doesn't know that. And in fact, most people don't know that. I would be surprised if most people did not see this as a political play, and a lot of them are just kind of willing to go along with it because of the obvious reasons you go along with anybody making a power grab. I mean, why did so many people go along with frickin' Clark back on Earth, you know? Delen insists on not going to Sheridan about the Neroon issue. She says, you know, if we cannot deal with this, then we have no right to be here. Well, that's not exactly an invalid perspective. It's also, by another perspective, a completely invalid perspective. One of the major themes of Babylon 5 has been being able to unify against greater forces, and the value of that. I've talked about that in many of our recent episodes. That just came up just in the previous episode, where we had to go fight the Shadow Destroyers, remember? We would not have been able to fight on those if we had to stand on our own. We would have been completely incapable. Does that biological concourse mean that we do not deserve to be part of this alliance because we cannot stand here alone? Now, I know those are different circumstances. I'm not trying to draw a direct parallel. I'm trying to draw attention to the ideology, because it is my opinion that Delen's response is because of pride. Despite everything, despite all the character growth that Delen has gone through, despite all her humanization, both in terms of characterization and in terms of the fact that she is becoming more human and less Minbari, she is still very concretely a Minbari, and Minbari have a lot of pride. And I think that she is looking at this from a Minbari perspective, which is, we will be able to do it because we are Minbari. And that's just obvious. I mean, we'll do it. We got this. Power! You know? That's just my opinion. I find it interesting, by the way Lanier goes around things. This is not the first time Lanier has bent or flat out broken the rules and talked his way around it. I would say this is a characterization of Lanier, but while it is, it also isn't. All Minbari kind of do that, if you pay attention. Well, almost all Minbari. Excuse me, I don't mean to generalize. In fact, to make the point, Neroon does the exact same thing in this episode. Even as Lanier logics his way around things, and Marcus calls him out on it too. Even as Lanier does that, Neroon does the exact same thing. They were fighting to the death. He allowed Marcus to live because he logicked his way around to say, "Oh, no, I'm the one who died." Totally. That is pulling a hell of a technically. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm glad Marcus isn't dead, but that is pulling a technically, or even a technically. And that is what the Minbari do constantly. And I like that it's being brought a little bit more into the forefront as Minbari politics are starting to become more and more of a problem. I like Narun, by the way, if that's not obvious. He's an interesting character in the fact that he is presented as if he is an obvious villain, but nothing about his behavior or attitude or his actual actions really indicates that. He is an obvious soldier, and he is a Minbari soldier. But villain? No, I don't think I can attach that label to him. Even at the beginning of this episode where he implicitly threatens Delenn with death, he still says, out of respect, I'm willing to walk away from this if you are. He doesn't say it that way. He says it in the Minbari way, but that is what he means. And I love the final scene there with him and Marcus and their laugh between each other. Because there's something strangely powerful in that moment. Oh, by the way, real quick, props to the actor when he walks in on Delenn's ceremony. Not only does he obviously have the blood on his staff, but he's limping. Just a little bit. It's a nice touch. Marcus obviously got some hits in there. Anyways, warriors, true warriors, the ideal of a warrior, the romanticized idea of a warrior, they tend to have that sort of mutual understanding thing. Probably the most common real-life source of this I tend to see people pointing to in fiction is Christmas during World War I. I forget the year, forgive me, but it was along the French and German lines, and during Christmas they were like, nope, we're not killing each other today. Talked and laughed and had tea and biscuits, and we're going to go back to killing each other the next day. There's actually been conflicting reports of exactly what happened, but there is a universal agreement that there was just kind of this, we're cool for the day moment there. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that happening, but I bring that example up because that's just kind of the warrior mindset. There's a sort of unique pessimism to being a warrior, understanding that your life is basically a currency and nothing more, that you may believe in your cause, you hopefully believe in your cause, you hopefully are enlisted for reasons that you actually care about, but in the end, you understand that you are a currency. It's one of the reasons why one of the first things that was ever ground into me by the military side of my family was that rule, you don't hurt civilians. Now that sounds like a weird place to start, and you might wonder why that relates to this point, but the whole point is that intricate? Oh God, I suddenly lost the word. Absolutely implicit within that phrase is the statement, civilian life is worth more than my life as a soldier, as a military, as a warrior. My life being put down for a civilian's life, 10 times out of 10, you do that. Because you don't hurt civilians. They are worth more. Now, from a moralistic perspective, or a rights perspective, or whatever, obviously that's not true. We're all people. But when it comes down to battles and conflicts and service and war, that's the ideal, not necessarily the reality, but the ideal of the warrior. And that is very much Narun and Marcus. Because you could tell there's a lot of interesting camaraderie between the two, and it's present without them having to do the slapping each other on the back kind of a thing like fiction usually resorts to. It's just the two of them recognizing and mutually respecting each other. It's a horrible thing to look at someone and call them friend and respect them, and then in the same sentence say, and now I have to kill you, and knowing the other person will have to try and kill you back. I'm reminded of Assassin's Creed 3, actually. I know that's a very hated game in general, but there was some very powerful themes undercurrent in that game, and it was probably the first game that really started to showcase how the two sides were not good and bad, they were just two sides. In my opinion, one of the strongest story points of the Assassin's Creed series. Not Assassin's Creed 3 in general, just that point that has been concurrent throughout the most recent games. And there's this scene where the two enemies are just, I'm not going to spoil anything, two enemies are just sitting at this bar, and they're both brutalized, and they're hurt, and they're bleeding, and they're gasping for breath, and they just look at each other, and they don't say a word. Just offer a drink, and he takes a drink, and he offers it back, and he takes a drink, and then he kills him. Because that's a warrior. Alright, we've hit some heavy stuff. Let's talk about the B-plot. Oh my god, the B-plot. Hang on, I'm taking this off for this. The B-plot does not deserve my awesome trench coat. Oh my god. Oh my god. Okay, so I'm just going to go off on this. I'm sorry. If you don't want to hear negativity, shut off the video now. I'm serious. I'm not holding back anything. You remember the episode Alliances over in Voyager? Because I remember that episode. It's not really mentioned as often as, say, Threshold, for example, because Threshold is worse in every way. But that's what this episode, the B-plot of this episode reminded me of. It's not lamentation level, but it did piss me off. And it was bad. Like, I would say third level bad. So, first of all, they kill the guy. Very stereotypical. Oh, God! Oh, God, I'm being pulled in. I'm dead. Oh, God. I'm not even going to question why a Zarg was at an open access panel and then ate something and then decided to move on. And then the people came and cleaned everything up and made it look like nothing happened. I am going to question how a manual count of the levels missed Gray 17. The fake Gray 17, of course. I remember watching this for the first time. And he's like, go to level 17. And he goes to level 17. Gray 17. And I'm like, oh, we found it! There it is! It's right there! Wow, a manual count couldn't find it, but he just hopped in the turbo-lift and boom! There it is! But no, obviously there is the actual, like, the hidden level of Gray 17. How do you miss that? They have scanners. They have the ability to track that. And yet manually counting the levels completely missed it? Really? Really, lady? Garibaldi figured that out in like a couple of minutes. Just by counting the distance between levels. Come on! I mean, okay. So, then there's another question. The lift closes right behind him. The implication is that they knew he was coming. Or, you know, something. It's your typical horror trope. I'm just going to lay it out. It's your typical horror trope. Somehow the villain is, or the antagonist or whatever, is always just right there, even if it defies all logic and reason. And they're always one step ahead of you, even if it defies all logic and reason. I remember, go ahead and make fun. I actually saw this movie. I Know What You Did Last Summer. Or maybe it was the second one. I don't remember which one. But it's this freaking guy who's like just this deranged dude, right? I mean, he is deranged and he's a killer, yeah, okay. But the stuff he pulls off in that movie is frankly ludicrous. And it only happens because horror. Because plot. Lazy writing, right? Well, there's several instances of that in this episode, and I don't feel like numbering all of them. Just watch the episode if you don't believe me. But the door closing and them seeing him coming and the doll going like, I mean, that was so cliche. I was actually rolling my eyes as I was watching it. That reminds me, why do you warn people when you're about to knock them out? I'm just wondering. Was that a pre-recorded message? Or was someone on the comm actually saying, I'm gonna get you, told you. And then, horror strings, as they get him. You know, consider the hand. Whoa, my hands are huge. They can touch anything but themselves. Oh, wait. I hope at least some of you get that reference. That was my first thought when I saw him giving the hand speech. It's like, I'm sorry, really? What? My hands. My hands. I legitimately, the first time I saw this episode, I thought they were all on drugs. I thought that was the point, that these were space hippies. It wouldn't be the first time... oh, excuse me. It wouldn't be the first time I've seen that. It would have been a while since I've seen that, because original series, but, you know. So, he gives this whole psychobabble crap about, you know, we are all the universe within us, and truly, the universe is us, and it made us. So let me go ahead and let me remove mockery for just a second. The theory being postulated by this cult, and it is called a cult by JMS himself, by the way, is that the universe is sentient, self-aware, and has decided to craft flawed, living creatures within it who will then die in a way to return to the universe so that the universe can then understand and better know itself. And once enough people have died after having reached this transcendent point, the universe will then be like, aha! I've got it! I've discovered a new recipe! And then it will remake the universe. I'm sorry, I said I would have no mockery, but I couldn't help it at the last second there. That just came to me. So, that's their cultist psychobabble. And I'm going to call it that because it is psychobabble. There's actually a whole argument that could be discussed about the difference between psychoanalysis and psychobabble. It's actually the same argument that can be handled between technical details and technobabble. There is a lot of gray in between those two categories. I usually look to how it is being employed and for what purpose it's being employed within a literary work to determine the difference between the two. But even that isn't a 100% accurate way of doing it. It's just a way I've used over the years. But I have a theory. You're going to hate me for this. Let's look at some facts. This is just a theory. I want to really make that clear. Okay? A lore theory. Thanks for watching. Now, I really hope he doesn't try to sue me over that. I can't deal with that. Okay, so JMS has gone on record more than once apologizing for this episode. Thing is, and I've done some digging on this, even before today, he usually apologizes for the Zarg. You ever notice that? Every time Grey 17 is Missing comes up, he tries to defend it by saying there's a decent amount of episode. In fact, believe a dark quote is, it's 3/4 of a good episode. And, by my own analysis, there was plenty to talk about up here, so, credit. But when he talks about this lower half down here, he always talks about the Zarg. You notice I haven't even brought it up yet until now. He always emphasizes that part, not the rest of it. He mentions in brief the Jeremiah thing didn't work, and then he talks about the Zarg, and the Zarg was horrible, and the Zarg was terrible, and he focuses on the... Even Sci-Fi Debris noticed this when he did his review of this episode. He was like, well, hang on a second. Why does he keep fixating on the Zarg situation? Now, the Zarg was a dumb guy in a rubber suit. Fair enough. And I'll talk about the Zarg later. But why fixate on that when it's the entirety of the B-plot that is, frankly, bad? And I'm sorry, it is. It's not really in keeping with Garibaldi's character. He doesn't stay on top of things. He lets Jeremiah just ramble on way more than he should. And the only reason to do that, from a writer's perspective, is if you want the audience to hear what the person is saying. So JMS kind of dismisses everything as if it's the Zarg's fault, as if it's the effects' fault. And he has also mentioned that this was a story he had in his head he wanted to get out, and this is the last time to do it. Now, I understand that feeling perfectly. I've got a dozen, thousand, trillion, billion stories in my head, and I try to get them out as much and often as I can. I don't succeed at that. But if I was writing a concrete story and I wanted to do this other side story thing, and I realized that with things coming to a head, and just taking a glance here, our next couple of episodes are And the Rock Cried Out No Hiding Place, Shadow Dancing, and Zahadoom. Yeah, it's pretty obvious. This is his last chance to do a side story, basically. So if he wanted to get this story out, this is the time to do it. I agree with that. But the relevant points here are JMS deflecting to the Zarg, the fact that the character is given far too much time to pontificate, and the fact that he really wanted to get this story out there. I don't have any more evidence for this, but I think JMS was trying to talk about a high-minded concept. Maybe something JMS himself believes, maybe something that he heard from someone else and he thought it was an interesting idea, maybe something he just wanted to posit to people. One of JMS's common writing concepts is the idea of putting out an idea and then just leaving it there and letting people decide what they think about it for themselves. Usually he does that by positing both sides of the idea so we can see both sides and have our own perspective on it, like he did in Passing Through Gethsemane. It's a great example of that with the destruction of personality thing. So that's what I think JMS was doing here. Either, again, this is something he actually believes, or was an idea he thought was interesting and wanted to pursue, and he just had to get it out there somewhere. Thing is, it's obviously rushed. The overall construction, if you pull yourself out of the episode for a moment, the construction of just the B-plot is laughable. It is so laughable, in fact, that it's the kind of thing that I would write. I mean that as an insult. As I said before, I am not a good writer. I may be a great person to write an encyclopedia, I could build you a setting with ridiculous levels of depth and complexity. I have strength and confidence in doing that. But actually writing? No, that takes something else, and I haven't had a lot of practice in that lately. I would need to spend a few more years really refining my writing technique in order to consider myself better than pure amateur. And that's my point. I have done enough analysis to recognize amateur writing when I see it, and this is it. In addition to that, it is an extremely basic default horror story that accomplishes nothing. It doesn't do any of the 5 points of story. Does it advance a plot? Or does it even really have a plot of its own right? Not really. I mean, you could argue this one, but in my personal and professional opinion, evil monster eats people is not a plot. Not unless it does something else. Which brings me to the next point. Characterization. Nope. Nothing new. I mean, we don't learn anything new about Garibaldi as existing, and none of the other characters are characterized sufficiently to learn anything about them. Character growth. Nope. Same basic problem. No one moves forward in the B-plot, specifically. Naroon obviously has some character growth over there. Okay. Setting. Nope. Nothing is really added other than the fact that there is a missing sector, missing level in Gray Sector, which nothing is ever relevant for before or since, and has nothing to do with anything, really. And finally, theme. Well, theme's debatable, I'll give you that. But again, the only way theme might be debatable is if the psychobabble was actually intended to be taken seriously. And, by the way, just an aside, I know I'm biased on this one, and I want to admit that. I don't like psychobabble. I don't. I don't like that kind of, oh, we just need to unlock our minds kind of thought process. Even when it's given sincerely and seriously, I don't like that kind of thing. When it's presented like this, that brings me to the final point. It doesn't satisfy any of the 5 points of story, but there is another point I rarely bring up when it comes to the 5 points of story, and that is comedy. It could just be enjoyable because, a comedy doesn't necessarily have to follow the 5 points of story. Not necessarily. But this doesn't feel like it was intended to be parody, even though in many ways it comes across as a parody. What else do I have in my thoughts here? We remember our former selves, and as such, we have unlocked... So apparently, I was wrong. We have learned something about this setting. Babylon 5 occurs within Pillars of Eternity. That's a joke for about 5 of you. We do not believe in violence. We just let people get frickin' murdered by a Zarg. Oh yeah, and now I'm going to finally talk about the Zarg, because the Zarg is ridiculous and stupid. And not just because it's a guy in a stupid suit. We've seen that before. We saw that back in Season 1. No, it is ridiculous because he is described as the perfect predator. Now, when we hear those words in fiction, there's certain things we've come to expect from them. Aliens, for example, the xenomorphs. Yeah, those are pretty apex predators right there. They are just pure killing machines, and they can't really do much other than kill and breed. And that's pretty much the definition of a perfect predator when you boil it down to. Able to continue going on, either through itself or through genetic continuance, and able to kill frickin' everything. Xenomorphs are pretty high tier if you really think about it. It takes knowledge of them in order to be able to fight back about them, or the ability to restrict their access. So when you compare, just think for a moment about how incredibly dangerous and nightmarish a single xenomorph is, and to put alongside this thing. I remind you the Zarg is defeated with a bullet. A bullet that is not shot at full velocity, because it's shot from being overheated by being in a steam pipe. A bullet. An antique bullet, actually. Well, I'm on the subject. I mean, we're talking a 66 millimeter, something like that? Or is it a 33? God, I can't remember. It was a revolver. I don't know what. Smith & Wesson, I think? I don't remember. Someone will be able to tell me. So, yeah. This thing. Now, let's be fair. Maybe it's just the cultist guy, Jeremiah, being crazy. Ooh, this terribly dangerous alien is the perfect predator. Look how terribly dangerous he is. And yet, the thing is, that is completely destroyed by two things. One, I refer you to my original point. There's no comedy here. This is being played straight, as if this is a straight-up horror story. So, no. Two, Garibaldi's reaction. Garibaldi doesn't say, oh, it's just a Zarg, oh, thank God. Or, a Zarg? Oh, that's pretty crazy, but I think we can deal with that. Or, no, he says, Zarg, are you insane? Oh my God, it's one of the most dangerous creatures in the sector. Well, if that's the most dangerous thing we got, or one of the most dangerous things we got in the sector, I think we're good, guys. Whew! I was worried there for a minute. Space is safe, guys. Space is safe. We're cool. He's killed by a bullet. What else do I need to say to that? Ugh. Some of that sucks. I hate it. I do have a final thought before I cut off here. Here, let me go ahead and get my coat back on, if I can. Ugh. I will say this. I fully expected this to be a lamentation. I'll be honest about that. But there's a reason I never actually give that label until I'm in the moment. I never decide until I'm at the episode. And who knows, maybe Code of Honor over in TNG won't be a lamentation. I wouldn't bet on it, but you never know. But I think a lot of people have the same reaction to this episode that I did before rewatching it. I almost always skip Grey 17 is Missing, even though some significant plot elements happen here. This is the beginning of Naroon's character arc, after all. This is when he starts shifting his character arc. He's had characterization before, but now he's having character growth. This is when Delenn becomes in charge of the Rangers. This is when the telepaths start being brought in. This is when Franklin is finally actually truly starting his walkabout. There's several significant events in this episode, but on repeat viewings, I don't need to see those. I know those things are happening. So I just kind of put those out of mind. And all I'm left with is the other thing. The horror story. The Zarg! And, oh, my hands, dude. So, as a result, I think most people have the same reaction to this episode that I did. That this is a crap episode. I don't think that's fair, though. I think the B-plot is garbage. You know, it is bad. It is definitively bad. But I don't think calling the whole episode bad is actually fair anymore. And I found that weird to say that, because if you'd asked me that same question literally yesterday, or like an hour and a half ago, before I watched this episode, I would have been right in this boat as saying, yeah, Grey 17 is crap. But it's not actually, in my opinion, it's not actually true. And I find that weird to realize that. And by the way, this is my own form of foreshadowing. Because I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek on something I'm doing in the future. I'm going to be looking at TNG in the future. And I have, semi-recently, rewatched Season 1 of TNG. And you know what? Aside from a few exceptions, it wasn't actually that bad. Anyways, we'll get to that later, of course. For now, I got nothing else. Oh my God, there's a Zarg coming! Oh, never mind. It's just a Zarg. Whew! Sorry, I'm okay. I was worried there for a second, but it's just a Zarg. It's just a Zarg. Oh God! Oh God, he's coming! He's coming! No!